5 years ago, a faith-based secondary institution in Langley, BC, Trinity Western University, submitted a proposal to the BC government to start a law school. It's been a little bit of a bumpy road ever since. 3 provincial law societies voted against TWU, and court battles followed, with TWU winning approval from BC and Nova Scotia, but losing at the Ontario Court of Appeal. Now the battle heads right up to the top of the Supreme Court of Canada. Now we're joined by Bob Kuhn via Skype, president of Trinity Western University. Bob, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, can you give us a little bit of a snapshot of a background here? Why are these law societies opposed to the concept of a Canadian university having a law school?
The basic principle that they're espousing is that because we have a community covenant, which is somewhat aspirational, somewhat a behavioral code of conduct for our constituency, our students, and for staff and faculty as well, that constitutes discrimination in their minds, and therefore they're not about to approve a deemed discriminatory environment for a law school. That's basically their position.
So essentially, the law societies admit that there's nothing wrong with TWU's law program, but claim that the covenant discriminates against LGBTQ2 students and unmarried couples and non-Christians. But the covenant also discriminates against a lot of other activities, for example, maybe vulgar language or drunkenness. The fact is, TWU is a private institution you have your own rules. So why should they really have much of a say when you're running your own organization?
Well, that's certainly a significant principle as a private Christian educational environment, which doesn't drain the public purses to operate its educational endeavors, including a School of Nursing, a School of Education. The university has been, for the last 55 years, a significant part of the fabric of higher education in Canada. And to suggest that all of a sudden, because same-sex marriage has been approved by the Civil Marriage Act, that we are no longer permitted to have those kind of religious parameters to define who we are as a community, a religious community.
Now, some people may not be aware as well, Bob, that you actually have gay students there at TWU. So it would seem evident that are they comfortable being part of the school?
Sure. We don't screen on the way in as to whether people have any particular belief systems or their sexual orientation is irrelevant to us in terms of their application to become students here. So that factor isn't taken into account, and there's no screening or discrimination or limitation or even unwelcoming attitude towards people who may consider themselves same-sex attracted or sexually oriented towards homosexuality. We do have a behavioral code which applies to both homosexual and heterosexuals, which precludes marriage or precludes sexual activity outside of marriage, and we define marriage as being between a man and a woman, as the biblical perspective would dictate in our view.
Now, I understand there's been a significant change in the Law Society's position since the case began. They now say they must reject TWU, not just because of your position on marriage, but also because of your distinctly Christian environment. Now, that sounds rather like a direct assault on freedom of religion. What are your thoughts?
Well, this has been a question of freedom of religion since the beginning, and it has been a question of emphasis. Is it primarily focused on LGBTQ issues? Is it focused on sexuality and the expression of one's sexual preference or orientation? Or is it much broader and just simply a question of, because we don't reflect the majority as an evangelical university or an evangelical school institution, that somehow that's objectionable? And so it's become less, perhaps not so much a new feature, but an emphasized feature that really precludes religion from the public square.
So this court case is pretty important. In fact, it might be precedent-setting. If TWU was to lose, implications that no faith group having similar beliefs in traditional marriage would ever be allowed to start a law school?
Well, that's the minimal implication for it. It's an important decision from a lot of perspectives. It's really definitional as to the extent to which faith groups, institutions, churches, even individuals have a right or the option to be part of the public square, part of the debate that is evident in the public square today. It's excluding, or it could have the effect of excluding, anyone from religious views that are perhaps not in sync with societal values.
Is there any evidence that lawyers who have graduated from faith-based institutions in other countries wind up discriminating against gay people, or maybe refusing to represent a gay person?
None that I'm aware of. In fact, there was some investigation done early on in this piece where the Law Society of British Columbia looked at other associations and looked for bad actors, if you would, that had come from Trinity Western, and they couldn't find any evidence of that. Having graduated from Trinity Western myself and having practiced law for over 35 years, it would be a surprise to me that anybody who was educated here could attribute some sort of negative aspect of their behavior to that education here.
Let's talk about a little bit of the irony as well, that the terms used by the Law Society, open, accepting, and inclusive, means excluding the majority of Canadian traditional faith communities. Talk a bit about that.
It is ironic. The language which we would see as characterizing us as some sort of bigoted environment is actually reflective, seems to me, of exactly the opposite. That is, if we're excluded from the public square, then it isn't inclusive in terms of an environment. It isn't open and accepting. It's really dictating the secular value system as being determinative, and no one who doesn't comply with secular values or have those as part of their belief system is not welcome in the public square.
So really, if these law societies had their way, they would really need to vet each other and judge each other to ensure that all agree with same-sex marriage so that no LGBTQ discrimination could possibly take place?
Well, in effect, it would eliminate any form of quote-unquote discrimination. Of course, discrimination is bandied about as a term without much definition. And discrimination is, from a positive perspective, we discriminate every day in many different ways, and certainly universities discriminate based on who can get into a university from a marks perspective or a skill perspective. So the idea of requiring to meet a faith test to become a member of the legal profession or any other profession or have any job is anathema, I think, to our Constitution and the fact that there are fundamental freedoms outlined in our Constitution which guarantee protection of those with religious or non-religious views from being discriminated against.
So the Supreme Court of Canada will conduct hearings on this case November 30th, December 1st. Tell me a bit about how that process will look.
Well, it's as you indicated, a two-day process. The first day we expect will be taken up with arguments from the primary parties, being Trinity Western, the Law Society of British Columbia, and the Law Society of Ontario, as it's now called. It used to be the Law Society of Upper Canada. Those arguments will take place on the first day. The second day will be comprised of some 26 or more interveners who have made application and been accepted for purposes of making written argument, which they've done, and 5 minutes of oral argument, which they will have the opportunity on Friday, December the 1st. And then that will be followed by a short reply opportunity for Trinity Western at the conclusion of those submissions.
Now, TWU did win at the Supreme Court of Canada level back in, I think it was 2001, against the BC College of Teachers, who had similar concerns. Are you anticipating a successful hearing?
We're confident that the Supreme Court of Canada understands these issues. Madam Justice McLaughlin, who's the Chief Justice, sat on the panel and I'm sure had a significant voice in the decision from 2001. And we expect that the court will want to recognize its own judgment as being at least persuasive, if not determinative.
Now, in a free society, government really shouldn't require lawyers, doctors, nurses, or other professionals to agree with the majority opinion in order to practice their professions. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Well, it belies the nature of rights at all. It wouldn't be necessary to have freedoms and so on if the majority view were just simply the dictating force in our society. The minority rights, such as rights of freedom of religion, are there to protect those, like Trinity Western University, that don't share the common perhaps secular environment or the common secular values that are evident in our society today. So critically necessary, critically important to the way we define freedom is to be free to differ, even differ quite strongly with views of others. And we recognize that in some cases that's what Trinity Western is doing. But to banish it from the public square by not allowing it to express its views or have a public approval of a law school that trains people in all the skills necessary for law school, and in our case, would be training people for charity work, for providing access to justice to those who can't afford it, many of whom are not necessarily poor, but middle class folks that just can't afford the justice system. That will be the focus of what we purport to do.
Well, it should be interesting to see what happens November 30th and December 1st. Dr. Bob Kuhn, president of Trinity Western University, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.